Well, hello, everyone. So excited to be here today. I didn't make it to DrupalCon. I was mixing my fix of all these sessions and seeing where people are going. Uh, I have a presentation today, and you're clearly interested, but there's a lot of folks who may want to come. So I'm going to focus today on the business case for making custom entities. And I want to leave some time at the end to do some hands-on demo. So if you have a moment, if you want to introduce yourself or drop in the chat how you relate to a Drupal site, whether you're the type of person who's doing a lot of code and you're creating a lot of custom modules and working with APIs, awesome. I have some great things to point you in the right direction. If you find yourself doing more site building stuff, using the Drupal UI to build out complicated structures, great demos for that as well. So if you like, feel free to say hi. Let me know, like, what level of depth do you get into in the code? And that might change how I portion out my time at the end of this session. With that said, let's jump in, because I have way more to talk about than we'll ever fit. So you should see a screen: outgrowing content types, building custom entities. Does that sound right? Maybe someone give me a visual wave. Awesome. Thumbs up, double thumbs up. You know it's going well. So we're here to talk about Drupal entities, those in core and those in contrib, and the benefits of building your own. I hope you leave this session with an understanding of the risks and challenges that you may have with creating your custom entities, but you also feel empowered to employ them in your own apps. Introduce myself, I'm Jim Vomero, and I'm a senior engineer at Four Kitchens. I've been working in Drupal over 10 years, and I use the framework for all my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations for homebrewing beer to planning my retro arcade projects, to even teaching kids to survive the zombie apocalypse at summer camps. If you have any questions after this presentation, please reach out. I'm always excited to talk shop and would love to keep this conversation going. There's my contact. I'm nJim on all the things, including Drupal Slack, so just say hello. I'm a web chef at Four Kitchens, and we build websites and apps for organizations that depend on large scale or unconventional content. And we work with associations, publishers, enterprise organizations, and media. And personally, I work a lot in higher education. Hello, friends, I see you. And we make big websites. So I'm going to get a little abstract. This is becoming a thought experiment, but it's important. What is an entity? And my answer has changed based on who I'm talking to. So this session is largely for technical decision makers. You may be a programmer, you may not. So like I said, if you have any thoughts, throw it in the chat. I'd love to know where you're at, and I'll customize some of my content based on who I see is here. So I see full stack, site builder. Yeah, okay. Intro to site building, content administration designer. Wonderful. This session is largely about business needs. And when a group you're building a site for may or may not need a custom entity, but the actual building, the custom entity, the training involved, I can fill an all-day workshop. So we'll scratch the surface. What does this look like? I said, well, what is an entity? Let's dive into that a little bit more. I'm going to go back. And in Drupal 6 was the first time we might have seen a database abstraction layer that even let Drupal have customization. So in Drupal 6, you might have had hundreds of modules. One of the loved ones was CCK, the Content Construction Kit. And this really brought powerful new features to Drupal. Instead of other CMSs at the time, this is when I got started, you were able to make your own content types. This was huge. It's why I picked Drupal for so many projects. The idea of having fieldable content was everything. And so we started putting everything in nodes. Our pages, they're nodes. Our blog pages, they're nodes. A new type of page called a landing page. Well, that's a node, but it also crept into other things. If you need to upload a file node, a video node, comments. Oh, geez, I guess that's a node. And we started to abuse it. A lot of confusion happened when everything was a node, and we had to rethink the model. So as quickly as we could, Drupal 7 got some emphasis on this idea of nodes or entities becoming more than just nodes. And we intentionally abstracted this term. Entities, it's a real general word, and it could be a little confusing what that may mean, because it can mean so many other things. But in Drupal, they're objects that are used for persistent storage of content or configuration, or both. And in Drupal 7, nodes, users, taxonomies, comments, these were all fieldable things. And then there was an entity API if you wanted to go and create your own thing. All right, let's move one step further into modern Drupal. Now we have entities as specifically typed objects. They're a thing in Drupal. Like, there's this thing called an entity, and we build so much of what makes up Drupal is from that. There's these tools like the content entity interface, the entity change interface, the entity owner, revision, publish. All these interfaces ensure that when we make something custom in Drupal, it works and plays nice in the same ecosystem. And not all content needs to be revisionable or translatable or track publishing details, but the features are in Drupal if we want to use them. And so that's where this entity API came from. There's a number of deep technical docs on Drupal.org about it. And we're going to explore a little bit in like the third act of this presentation. To get you one step closer to us using the same terms, I just want to look at like what's in Drupal core and the contrib space that we often use. And truthfully, almost every site I build nowadays uses the out-of-the-box Drupal experience, maybe a couple of other modules to extend its functionality. So in core, content types, that's my number one entity. That's nodes. So a content type, that's my pages, maybe my events or blog. Use the user entity, right? Someone's logging in, but a user is a thing. You can have another one and another one. Files and media, that's a type of entity. And that's just Drupal core. There's also this concept of bundle that I'm going to sprinkle throughout this presentation. So I just wanted to address that. What does that mean? Bundle is a keyword. It's flexible versions of an entity. So users don't have bundles. A user is a user. If you add a field to one user, all users get that field. But content types like nodes, those are bundles. We can have an event node and a blog post node. They follow similar rules, but they have different definitions. The blog post may have an author field. The event may have a start and end date. So they're the same entity, multiple bundles. And so I put this little cheat sheet to introduce that because this becomes important if you want to blaze your own trail with custom entities. One of your first decisions is, am I going to support bundles or not? It's a bit of a thinking exercise, and it can have long-term impacts on your site. Beyond the ones that come with Drupal out of the box, I've used comment, not so much lately. Contact form has its own entity. Menu link content, that's an entity. Shortcut, there's a lot. Entities, if you can store it as content in Drupal, the ideal storage container is an entity. Trying to resize the window so I can see everyone's faces. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions along the way. I'm doing a lot of setup. So I mentioned there were some contrib entities, some other ones I've used, paragraph, web forms, and the submissions. It's really two separate entity types. Paths, meta tags, redirect, and groups. I've used all these, and very rarely do I have to create custom entities anymore. Looking at these modules, what's under the hood is best. These contrib ones are great too, but it's rare I need to create new ones. When I do, I need to make sure it's worth the effort because it is not for the light of heart. So why would I want to create a custom entity? Okay, we're at the core of today's presentation. As I said, between core and contrib, we have a lot of our exposal, and Drupal 9 makes it really easy to add new ones. It's not usually out of necessity. I can usually use a node to do almost anything, or a user, or a paragraph, but there are still solid reasons to build a custom entity. And so I've prepared 8 examples, I think, of why you would want to use a custom entity on your site, and some of the benefits, and then later some of the risks. Let's go through them. First one, reason number 1, use a custom entity when a content type is too big. So this is my go-to case. Sometimes nodes are just too big for the job. And so you consider the story that as a publisher, you want to add reusable callouts or cards to some ancillary content area. So maybe something that always appears in the sidebar. I have 3 examples here on the screen, and they all look and act different. You know, one is a button, one is a link, another, the entire card is the link, but they're also very similar. They're all an image, a link, one or more text fields. Depending on your architecture, you can use Drupal paragraphs for this, right? It's just a little piece of content that sits on a page. But maybe I want to make these reusable. I want to have a library of this content on my site. That's a great use case for a custom entity. It exists in its own database, and so I can have one or more bundles of these card items, maybe a person spotlight, or an infographic, or a banner, or a call to action library using our custom entities. If I made these in nodes, each one would have a public URL. Each one might be searchable by default, at least in the index. They'd have meta rules. They would maybe be in your sitemap. And this is content I would never want to display on its own, right? It should only appear in a sidebar. So a lot of the features in Node, the publishing, the promotion, I don't want those features. And so Node is too big. That's my first reason. I want something that's more lean, doesn't have all those features. Now you could still do this as Node, and I'd recommend the rabbit hole module if you ever use entities for, or if you ever used content types for displaying like sidebar information. My second reason is on the same line, reducing overhead. So content types are too big. This is a project I did many years ago for brewing beer in my home. I had connected up to my Raspberry Pi, and I was just trying to get time and temperature readings. So once every 5 minutes, I was getting information about what was the current temperature. And so I had this data feed, and it would say, okay, at this time, this is the temperature. And I knew what recipe it was. So it's like really lightweight data. And I wanted to store this in Drupal because I'm a Drupal dev and that's what I do, right? Let's put it there. Complete overkill. And a node is also complete overkill. If I was going to store this data in a node, so every node was a temperature reading, I'd have an add form, an edit form, access controls, permissions, revisioning, translations, maybe. Like I'd have all these interfaces that I don't need. I just want to store some data. And there's a few ways to do that. I could make a custom table just in Drupal, just a random table where I store things in my database. But now it's sitting next to Drupal. It's not really part of Drupal. I can't leverage views, for instance, because it's a separate thing. It's just a random table in a database. Drupal views doesn't know about that. But if I use the entity API and I make an entity that just has temperature and time readings, it's a very small entity. It has very little storage, very little has to load, none of the hooks. And Drupal knows about it, so we can start using it in other parts of my site. I can make a view. I can add, remove, update records. I can do calculations. So anything that I normally do in Drupal, I can do because it's an entity. Next case, optimization. This is the opposite side of things. Sometimes you want to make a custom entity because a node is just too darn small for what you want to do. In this example, let's consider a nonprofit that has regional offices. So they have an office in Miami, DC, San Francisco, and each one of these offices, each one of these locations has content that's specific to it, a staff directory, a contact page, maybe a thing about their community charter, what they're doing for that community. Every office has that content. Now, some of the offices are real go-getters and they have like a blog. Not all of them write a blog. Or another one has an extensive person directory to contact people, but not every location has that. There's a lot of ways I could build these regional offices. One is with the groups module. I've certainly done that. But groups is big. It's a commitment, and I end up usually writing custom validations, and it's certainly not solving my cases, all my business cases. For me, I might want to create a node. Let's just say a node. I have a node, and it's called regional office, and each regional office gets an instance. This works okay, but the problem is nodes are something that want to display on their own, right? You go to node 1, node 2, node 3. In this case, I'm using nodes to store all kinds of metadata, right? Blog indexes, people information. So I actually want to take all this data that's being stored about a regional office, and I want to make multiple pages out of it. That's my use case for a custom entity, where things are stored and displayed in this referential way. I can get deep in the programming and do some fun things with it, way more than what a node would want to do. I've used this many times in the past on university websites, where there's like an academic program, or where a student might go to pursue one or more degrees, and it's the group in charge of economics, and they want to have a page on faculty and staff, a page on admissions requirements, a page on tuition information and deadlines. Every program, every degree, at least at that university, is going to have similar information. So having a custom entity, and they all have the same form fields, becomes a very predictable way to take this cookie cutter data type and extend it to every part of the university. So, there's my custom entity. It's called a department, and every department is in charge of their one, not in this case node, but their department entity. Has all the fields, but it might not display in just one URL. It might populate a whole microsite. Reason number 3, creating custom entities allows you to customize the presentation of data. So I run, I mentioned zombie apocalypse in my intro. There is a summer camp company in Philadelphia that I helped start, where we teach kids to get outdoors and be active. We have a lot of fun, and I have a regional staff, about 12 people, and they submit their time tracking online, so their hours and their mileage. I could do this as a Drupal node. That's not a problem. After submitting a timesheet, the camp director gets an email. It says, go back in, see how much they, validate the card, put it through the workflow, approve the card, figure out how much we owe them. Maybe we have to reimburse extra for mileage, or we have to make a change to the timesheet. So I'm building up a little accounting system in Drupal. I could store all that data in a node. That is not a problem. But there's a lot of things I don't like about the node. First, after somebody submits their timesheet, I don't want them to edit again. And when they do submit their timesheet and the timesheet's eventually approved, I don't want that edited at all. This is a transactional log of how much we paid. If something ever happened to that data, I can find myself in legal trouble, right? If I need to defend this later on. So as much as it would be easy to create a node that has fields of like, how much did you work every day? How many miles did you drive? Do we owe you for reimbursement? I've chose to put those exact fields in a custom entity because I'm able to manage the permissions more granularly. I'm able to create that custom workflow where messages are sent, the correct people can access the form at the correct time. I'm able to do things like verify that no one outside of the site can ever see this data. All the revision stuff is turned off. I can even make sure that nobody, not even myself, can delete the time card. I have access to all the permissions since I'm the one who created the custom entity. So the presentation of and customizing the editorial experience is a big thing for me for custom entities. If you don't like how nodes work, you might find yourself limited. And I kind of already went on to this, but I'll give another example of defining unique access roles and permissions. This is years ago. I created a ticketing system. I didn't want to. Drupal wasn't the best source for the job, but it was what the group was already using. So we created a whole ticketing system. It was a fun project. Whew, it was work. And we could have made every ticket a node, right? A user can fill out a ticket, say, I need request help, and it's a node. But in this case, there were so many unique access rules that it just wasn't the right fit for the job. So tickets came into the system multiple ways. There was an online form. People can call the help desk with their phone or send an email, or just people walked in. And then the help desk staff would have to assign these tickets to one of their support teams, IT support, equipment, rentals, the training team, there was a bunch. Each ticket went through a very different workflow depending on what team it was assigned to. And so just to give a quick background, an authenticated user, one of their customers, could create a ticket and they can view it, but they couldn't edit it after they submitted their ticket. They can comment on it if someone asked questions, but they weren't allowed to change which team it was a part of. Help desk staff could create tickets and assign them to teams. They were also able to update details if questions came in. And then once it was assigned to a team, a person who had that ticket was able to make changes, ask questions to the original user, and then push it through the workflow. If everything was looking right, would say, oh, yep, this ticket is closed. There was a lot of permissions and they were highly dynamic because if this ticket is assigned to team A, only this group's allowed to edit it. It's assigned to team B, then team B is allowed to edit it. And creating all this logic of who can edit it when would have been a real chore with nodes. That permissions table doesn't exist. But I was able to do it with a few lines of PHP because it was a custom entity. So if you have a need to really start altering the node form or any of the forms or the permissions or how the workflow interacts with those, you might be thinking custom entities are a good tool for the job. All right, I'm getting to some other extreme cases, but ones you've probably seen. When you want to reuse content definitions through bundles, this is a great case for custom entities. I've made this website a bunch of times in my career. It's the conference website. You're putting on a Drupal conference and you want to have different types of sessions. There's 5 conference sessions in my example here. So a session, a keynote, a workshop, a social event, and a bird of a feather session. And these activities are all very similar. They all have a title, a location, a time slot, and a description. So as you're going through the agenda, these attributes are all there. But the birds of a feather are sort of created on the fly. There might not be an image to promote it. And the workshop and social events require registration. So there's like a registration link, maybe payment processing. The keynote speaker has all kinds of marketing collateral. They have a banner and verbose information about them. It's probably bigger in scope or at least in definition than the other ones. And so if I was going to create nodes for all of these, I could just create these fields on nodes, but they're all siblings along with page, event, blog, and that doesn't help me with scale. By creating a custom entity called, I don't know, a session entity, what I'm able to do is say, okay, these are 1, 2, 3, 4. These are my 4 base field: title, location, time slot, description. And that becomes a cookie cutter moving forward. So that if I add any other type of session, I guarantee that it always has a title, a location, a time slot, and description. And so if I add, I'm trying to think of a good example, a break in the convention hall. to go meet with vendors. It's no matter what, it's going to get a title, location, time slot, description every time I add an entity. If I change a definition, so if I change how location fields work on one, I change it for all because they're all tied as the same entity. And so this is a great use of bundles and also just showing like what a base field is. I'm going to show an example of that in code in just in a minute. It also makes sense to keep this separate from other logic. So like page content and web form content, it's not the same. It's different templates, it's different interactions on the site. So being able to separate those concerns and encapsulate the things that really are similar is a great use for custom entities. I think I have one or two more to go. Okay, here's the last big one. When performance is a highly valued goal. This is a bit of a stretch because rarely do we use PHP applications for things that are highly performant, but it is something we care about. So by default, entity storage by core provides one or two tables for each entity. So there's a node table and a node field table. And then you have fields you have tables in the database for every field. So let's assume I was making this like weather app. This is actually something I just helped my father make because he's trying to experiment with like a weather station or saving the data. So we have what was the high temperature for the day, the low temperature for the day, how long were we recording data, just 3 fields. And when I create this as a node in Drupal, it means that there's a node table, a node revision table, and then actually fields for revisions of each one of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 fields or 10 database tables just to make a node. Every time you add a field, it's going to add at least 2 tables, if not more. This is a lot to pull back together when you're just trying to do some reporting or some calculations. 90% of the time, I want Drupal to be in charge of where my data goes. But every now and again, especially if I'm thinking about performance, I may decide, this doesn't work for me. I'm going to make my own entity, and I'm just going to put all the data in a single table. One table, it's called weather. It records everything in that one table. Now I can do very fast calculations and queries against it. I don't have to start to aggregate all of that revisionable stuff into one place. So I'm not going to talk about this too much because I don't think it adds a lot of value to most of the work we do, but it is something very interesting to think about. We don't normally think about where Drupal stores the data, but we do have the ability to control it if we have custom entities. My last use case, I really won't dive into because I think this is really outside of what most people need, but it's worth mentioning. And that is just the non-standard storage for your model data. Drupal doesn't actually care where you store a lot of your data, and it doesn't even need to be in your database. So there's a project worth checking out called External Entities, where I think in their example, they're using Wikipedia to be the source. So you can have a custom entity, but it's really just a reference to external data like a JSON file or a data feed. And so now you can have externally hosted data like Wikimedia data in your site. Drupal thinks it's native. It thinks it's your database. It doesn't know the difference. So external entities is worth checking out. Phew, that was a lot. I hope at least one of these reasons has you excited and say, yeah, I could do that. I might need to be able to reuse content types or have bundles that are all similar, or I might worry about performance, or my content types might be really small or really big and it just doesn't fit a node. So I hope you feel a little excited, a little empowered, and you're ready to create those entities. But with that, caution, like I want to talk anyone away from doing this right away. The truth is there's a lot of reasons not to build a custom entity. And I have to say all this before I put you in charge of making those decisions, right? So number one, there is a steep learning curve with the Entity API versus other ones. It's pretty easy to get started creating Drupal blocks or modifying a form. Entities has a lot of mystery, and there's probably not enough documentation to really get you up to date fast. So if this is your first time at this part of Drupal development, you may want to back away or use a tool that does the work for you. The second, it's less likely for a contributed module to work with your custom entities, but that's becoming more and more likely over time. So there was a time where all our tools were like nodes, node-based, views looked at nodes, or if you had something that changed the publishing workflow, your workflow was looking at nodes. All of these core Drupal projects are now updating So instead of just looking at nodes, they look at any type of entity. And so you can do things like workflow, publishing workflows, revisioning, media management. All these things are now looking at entities of any type, but it is still possible you'll hit a case, and you just want to be cautious of that. The third reason is custom entities may not inherit future Drupal features. Drupal's not done changing. In fact, just in the last few years, we've seen Node get some rewrites to its interface. Nothing our users would note about, but it was important to note that, like, behind the scenes, how the node exists was updated. If you've made your own custom entity, you're not getting those new features by default. You're now responsible for pulling that into your code. So be cautious there. And for you're now responsible for maintaining custom code, and there's a lot of potential for technical debt. So in my case of the user's timesheets, where I have certain groups of people are able to add or edit or remove timesheets, that might be locked down to individual users based on their ID. If I hire new people, I have to now figure out a way to change those permissions. It's in the code. Good on me if I remember where everything is, but that really is my responsibility. I'll pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to drop it in the chat, and then I'd love to do some demos. Or you can speak up. That's up to y'all. All right, let's do this. So I spun up a Drupal site. We're using Lando for all of our stuff. So if you haven't experimented with the food magazine demo, it's a fantastic place to start. And I decided in the final hours that I wanted to do a live demo. I thought, this is great. Let's do this together. So I'm going to just work in the open and show you around my new site. Hopefully my font sizes are big enough. I can make things a little larger, I suppose. Okay. So this is a Drupal site out of the box. Let me make sure things are installed. If you're unfamiliar with Lando, it is a recipe builder for Docker. And so it's going to just give me a containerized environment. It means that I prefix all of my commands with Lando. So Lando drush. I can look at the watchdog. So there we go. And I'm going to use Lando to run Drupal Console. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Drupal Console, well, actually, maybe I should start with ECK. I don't remember if it's on this site. If not, we're going to install it. ECK. The entity construction kit. Let's do the version of this that requires no code. So if you want to create a custom entity and you do not have the deep programming experiences, or you just feel like these APIs sound like they may be tough, Entity Construction Kit is the right fit for you. If nothing else, it's a great way to experiment. So let's install ECK. And one of the most important things is you're going to see it doesn't really do anything out of the box. I might actually, while I'm here, let me also add in that toolbar, because I don't want to have to click through all the menus during this demo. All right. So now one of the things you'll see is what we get here is a new menu item called ECK entity types. And I'm on a recipe building site. So I start thinking through, well, I have something, and maybe it's that first business case. I don't want to add another recipe. A recipe is a big full-blown thing. It has attributes on ingredients to buy, orders of operations, photos of the recipe, attribution to who created the recipe. It's a full-fledged piece of content that could stand on its own. I want to create something else. It's something that just kind of sits in the sidebar. And so I'm going to call mine seasonings. I'm going to call it seasonings. So this is going to be things that we might sprinkle on top, but they don't merit their own page in Drupal. Being something that is on its own, it just appears in a sidebar or as a call out in the ingredients list. I mentioned before base fields. So with ECK, you don't have the ability to override things without some custom code, but you can decide, does this even need an authorship? Maybe it doesn't. Nodes always do, and create time, date. In fact, the only thing I'm going to give it is a title. Every seasoning needs a title or a name for that type of seasoning. And let's create it. And there we go. If I was going to make this analogy, we've created a new thing like a node or a user or taxonomy, not the terms themselves. We've created a parent definition for those things. The other thing you're limited to, since we're not doing this with code, we're doing with this entity construction kit, is it's going to assume that everything needs bundles. You can create just one bundle, but for our case, let's assume we're going to add just a couple of bundles. So what different types of seasoning are there? There's extracts, right? Or vanilla and almond extracts. Maybe that's one type. And let's add one more bundle. Spices. Now you do have the ability, if you want to get fancy in your code, to go in and programmatically make decisions based on all of these things, because there is now a new entity called seasoning with two new bundles, extract and spices. I can start creating fields for each one of these. I'm not going to because it just would push this demo way too long. But just like nodes, they can each have their own field definition, their own managed form, their own managed display. So you can have page, article, blog post, whatever your nodes are. Here, I have a seasoning seasoning entity, and my bundles are extract, spices. Oh, I shouldn't have picked something culinary. I don't have enough examples. Work on your own. So there we go. I've created my new ECK thing. Let me go back up to that top level link, ECK types. Maybe now I want to create some content. And so in normal Drupal, you would go to content, add content, and here's your links. I wish ECK did it, but I understand they don't want to be too opinionated. I always add this to the content. So I would put in add seasoning link in my main content menu, but it is here. So there at least is a place where you can go and say, I would like to make a new spice. And my new spice is called pepper. Wow, we've added a new entity and an instance of that entity. Let's add one more. And to show you how ECK does hook into things, you might have already set admin themes on your node forms. You can do the same for your ECK forms. I'm going to do that just to provide a little more continuity. So let's go structure. Let's check out my entity types and add a new one. And we'll say salt. Is that a seasoning? I don't know. Is it so much baser? Oops, I don't want to create a new entity type. I want to create a new piece of content. Here we go. And so what I have here now is content being stored in Drupal in a very particular way. It's separate from nodes. Nodes have publishing workflows. Nodes might appear in your XML sitemap, your internal site search. These are all very separate. And so I will often use ECK if I want a no-code solution to storing all of that ancillary information, the things that might be in the sidebar or things that may appear as metadata under a user or something of that nature. So that's ECK. Any questions on using ECK? Because I'd like to show off a little bit of the more programming examples too. All right, let's do it. I was getting ahead of myself before, but now I could show off. Here's my demo site, and we're going to do this together. So if you've never created a custom module before, this is probably past your skill set. But if you have, let's give it a try. One of the tools I use regularly is Drupal Console because it has so much wonderful boilerplate for helping make decisions. It's also a great way to learn how Drupal works. So I can put Lando Drupal generate module, and I actually already pre-filled this one. So the module is called gadgets. I'm going to have all my cooking gadgets. I'll hit enter. It might ask me a couple of questions on this. Enter Drupal core version. Oh, I think you need to get updated Drupal console. That's not necessarily an appropriate question at the moment. I don't want a custom module. It's not a feature. I'm not going to add a composer file. It's not a dependency. I'm answering no to almost everything. It doesn't need a template. And go ahead, let's generate it. All this did was create a custom module. And so if I go to this path, oh, am I not? Oh, change directory web. And then, so all we have right now is an info file, which is what you're probably used to. I think this definition has changed. Does anybody know what it's supposed to be? I'll pull it from another project. Yeah, that is no longer the correct way to generate it. But Drupal console is a great way to generate code on the fly. And you just don't have to keep all that boilerplate in your head from memory. So I have a new module. I can enable it, but it doesn't do anything because the only thing it is in it is an info file to show that the module exists. So something else I can do with Drupal console is generate a custom entity. So Lando, Drupal, generate entity content. It can generate config entities as well, and that also has a useful place, but we're just going to talk about content entities for this demo. And once again, it's going to walk me through some of the questions to complete this process. Which module do I want to store this? Well, I have a gadget module. Let's put it in there. What is the name of my custom entity? I'm going to use this entity to talk about all the cooking tools. So once again, I'm going to have little things that are featured on recipes, but they don't stand alone as their own content. A node would be overkill if the thing is just a picture of a spatula and the name spatula. So I'm going to call this a gadget entity. And the machine name, actually, I think gadget underscore entity might just be a little verbose. I can just call it a gadget. The label of my new content, gadget. The base path, where do I want this to appear in the admin toolbar? Admin structure sounds great. All of this can be changed later. Will this have bundles? In ECK, you have to have bundles, but now we're doing custom code. We have the ability to decide, you don't know, a gadget is a gadget. I don't need lots of different families of them. That is a harder one to change in retrospect. Is this translatable for the sake of today's demo? No, and the same with revisionable, because that just adds more boilerplate and it might be difficult to show off everything in just a few minutes. Should my content have forms? I mean, this is where we start to see something neat. Like we can get rid of the add and edit and delete all those forms that you get with nodes. You don't have to have. It's a choose your own adventure now. I'm going to say yes, because I want to see what we can override in one of them. Does my entity have an owner? Nah, that's just more fields. There we go. Generated 100 or 614 lines of code. It created a lot. This is stuff that if you were creating custom entities regularly as part of the work you do, that you'd have to memorize or have a cheat sheet. Drupal console kind of just gave me out of the box basics, like the least I need to feel productive. So highly recommend Drupal console, especially if you want to learn how things like the entity API work. Create a module, create your entity inside it, and then create another one. Instead of saying translatable no or yes, change it to no, or no to yes. Same with revisionable. Change one of these and see how the output of the code changed. It's a great way to see how the API looks and works. All these new files are now populated in my custom gadget entity. And let me just turn it on. Lando, Drush, enable the module. I think it's called, gadgets. We'll turn it on. We'll say, yep, that's an entity. And then we'll see where things can go from here as somebody who wants to do some custom coding. So just like the ECK module, we decided to put our new entity in structure, and there's a spot called Gadget List. And Gadget List is the same as if you went to the main content. So this is for nodes. This is all your node content, people, users. This is your list of users. I guess if you just click people, Gadget List is here. I will often take this and I'll throw it in the content menu because that's where my content authors expect to find it. So there's none yet. The other is gadget settings. And this is the same as if you were managing fields. So you can manage your fields, manage your form, manage your display. By default, it is going to have a title, but maybe we can add another field just to show off how it works. And we'll make it a link. And let's say I get some affiliated marketing by now. Maybe it's a link for someone to buy this from a boutique cooking store, and I get a referral every time someone buys something through my recipe in my blog site. So I've added a link. Every gadget I create now will have that buy now field. And just like working with nodes, you have the exact same API at your disposal. So let's make one and then we'll see what's happening in the code. Here's my manage all gadgets. So it's under structure, gadget lists, and I'm going to add a new one. And it looks like I already have some stuff in here. I want to make a new whisk, and I don't really have a URL available. So I'm going to skip that for now and I'll leave it published. And now I'm viewing the whisk page. I've created something that, just like in our ECK example, it's not a node. It's not in the search index. It's not going through our workflow. A lot of the things that nodes have do not apply to this at the moment. It's a choose your own adventure. Let's create one more. Add a gadget and a bowl. And there we go. So what actually is going on in this code? There's a lot to take in. I'll just show you a couple of highlights. The most important, if you're used to the convention, PRS4 here, we're going to be in the source directory. particularly in entity, gadget entity. This is where we're going to see most of the interesting code that shows how an entity should exist and how it relates to other parts of Drupal. In fact, almost everything that I care about is in this green comment. Yes, it's a comment, but this annotation is functional. This actually does loads things into Drupal in its discovery mechanisms. So our content entity is called Gadget. It has this section on handlers. And this is wonderful. So that view list and list builder, when I want to see a list of entities, where do I go for that? There's a class. So if I had some custom logic, I wanted to change structure gadget list. If I wanted to change this interface in a significant way, I can do that. I think right here. I always get confused of these two. You'd have to check it out. Forms. It's the add a gadget form, the edit a gadget form, the default form. Actually, they're all using the same one out of the box, but you have the ability to say, you know what, when I'm adding, I'm going to get a certain form. When I'm editing, I'm going to get a different one. This is how I do my timesheets, that a user adding a timesheet has a different user experience than somebody who's managing the timesheet as it moves through the workflow and we can get them paid. And I've actually made it so you can't get to the delete form for my timesheets. I just get rid of this, or actually I did it in access controls, but I can also get rid of this so the form does not exist. There's also a couple other unique ones that you might want to check out. Canonical. This is like, where is this thing when viewable to the public if we're looking at it? For nodes, it's always like node / and then the node ID, node 5 by default, unless you have some sort of path auto on. For the out of the box, it's saying it's going to be admin, structure, gadget, and gadget ID. And if we look at one of those, let's take a look at Whisk. I see it's admin, structure, gadget, and gadget ID, well, / edit. I guess I can view it. So the view doesn't have the word edit. And that's exactly what we see here. So that's the path to view it, to add it, to edit it, to delete it. You have full control now to start changing these things for your custom entity. It's actually a lot of power as you start going into custom workflows. So that's one fun feature of entities, is how this annotation gives you access. The second is, let's see where these things go. So let's imagine I'm working on this site and I just need to load 150 gadgets, new products for my blog. Every time I added one, it took me back to view it. I want to rapid fire these. Actually, I do have an example. Let me pick something more tangible. When I created that ticketing system and I created a help desk ticket entity, often at some point in the day, the person who works the help desk has to manually load all of them into the website when they get calls or walk-in traffic. And so they add a ticket, then add another, then add another, then add another. When they add a ticket and they click save, they want to go back to the add a ticket form. Well, that's something we can do. Here is the add form. Let's find it. Gadgets, forms, and there's the add form. A lot of code in here. If you're unfamiliar with it, this is a great way to learn because somebody else generated code that's fairly useful. Here's the save method. So what happens when I'm creating a new instance of my entity and I click save? I can do some validation in here. I probably shouldn't. I should do it up above, but I could. I could, throw errors, redirect. This is like, where do I want users to go? So maybe instead of going to entity, gadget, canonical, I want to go to the add form. Or maybe I just don't even want to redirect them. Maybe I want them to see the content that they just edited. I just had that request come in on another site. So I'm going to comment that line out. And what I should see is if I go to my gadget list, let's add a new one. Let's add a measuring cup. I click save and it no longer redirects. Oh, darn, of course it did. You have to clear caches, I bet. But I could try it again. Let's try it again. It's important. When we're doing demos, it's important to fail, right? Let's try it. Oh, wait. Yeah, I'm back to add. Oh, I guess if you don't redirect, you're still in the add form. It did work. Never mind. Fork. It's a cooking gadget, primitive, but it cooks. And this should not redirect, so it reloads at the add page. So this is what I did for the group that was in charge of the help desk, and they wanted to add another, add another, add another. Like I said, this is not going to be a useful demo on how to create your custom entities. That's a full day workshop, but I at least wanted to point out that if you use Drupal Console, it's going to get you pretty far there. This is one of the files I use the most often. So gadget entity access control handler. This is, who has access. And then it's going to also create access has its own. By default, it's creating permissions, but you can create your own permissions. So in the ticketing system example, I had it that the help desk was allowed to edit it up until a certain point. Once the issue was resolved and marked fixed, then they can't go back and change the history of that ticket. So you can have full control. And if you can do it in PHP, you can now make Drupal respect that business logic. Because we're getting short on time, I am going to jump. Is there anything anyone wants to see while I have the code up? And I can jump in at the end too. Okay. I don't know when I'm supposed to be done. I just realized I'm rambling a lot, but let me wrap it up and then I'll be available if folks have questions. So we checked out ECK, we checked out Drupal Console, and oh, I'm already there to thank you. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope that this is a little empowering and shows you some opportunities to get started. Actually, really is easy to get started either with ECK or the Drupal Console code generator. There's a lot you can do with this, and there's a lot you can get yourself in danger. So tread lightly, reach out if you have any questions, because this is fun. This is really what taught me the inner workings of Drupal, was realizing that most of my content that I was making on these complicated sites, it wasn't a node. And I was constantly taking a node and making it into something it wasn't. The permissions weren't right. The workflow wasn't right. Stuff was surfacing where it shouldn't. And as soon as I learned custom entities, things started to come all together. So please hit me up on all the Drupal channels. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I know you have other sessions to get to, but I am here if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.
Great. I will stop screen sharing in case anyone wants to